Before I had even looked at this assignment, I just happened to watch a film which covers the topic of suicide very recently. That being the 2017 Western drama Hostiles. A very brief plot summary is that it focuses on the story of retiring U.S. Army Captain Joe Blocker, who has for many years fought and hated Native Americans, who is given a final mission of escorting his sworn enemy, Chief Yellowhawk, who is dying of cancer, back to his ancestral homeland so that he can be buried in sacred ground. There are three characters in this film who experience one of the levels of suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, and suicide, as discussed in class on October 31st. Blocker experiences suicidal ideation. He seriously contemplates suicide after being given this last mission before ultimately deciding against it. Quaid, uh, who is rescued by Blocker and his men, attempts suicide. Her family is killed, but is inevitably stopped by Blocker, who seeks to comfort her through his shared experience without attempting to take over the discussion, but instead allowing himself to be vulnerable so that she doesn't feel alone. Blocker can actually be seen engaging in what was described in our October 17th lecture as practical compassion. He listens to Quaid more than he talks. He's comfortable laying with her in silence when they share a tent during a storm, and he offers her specific help during particularly tough moments instead of just empty platitudes. And finally, Metz, uh, who actually dies by suicide in the film. So the two characters, Blocker and Quaid, who experience suicidal ideation and a suicide attempt, are both missing one of Thomas Joiner's predictors for suicide risk discussed in lecture on November 3rd, with Blocker still feeling a sense of belonging, especially through a sense of duty, particularly in how his continued service can aid Metz. And Rosalie Quaid, after her own suicide attempt to stop by Blocker, can be seen making an active effort to make herself useful to the group in order to combat her perceived burdensomeness that she initially expresses. Metz, meanwhile, is experiencing thwarted belongingness after he feels that he's been betrayed by the country that he has served for so long. He feels that he is a burden to Blocker and that his past actions make him a burden to the native peoples. And he is capable of suicide. As his final words to Blocker are that he doesn't feel anything. And he's already established that he has become numb to death over all these years. I feel that overall, this film actually does an excellent job in its presentation of suicide. I think that Metz's story in particular is a good reflection of something that Kevin Hines talked about in his story about his journey from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, or journey back from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, when he says that when you silence your pain, it bubbles and grows until it bursts. Metz is very open about the fact that, well, he isn't open. He's proud of his numbness to the death and destruction that he's wrought. And he's only able to be truly vulnerable when, in the end, it is coupled with his suicidal ideation and intentions. Uh, and going a bit more into how the film portrays suicide, pulling from um, the media representation checklist on reportingonsuicide.com. Uh, One question that it asks is it describing or depicting the method and location of suicide? And I think that the film actually does a pretty good job of keeping the actual suicide off screen. It does not depict it. It leaves it up to interpretation by the viewer, although it isn't. So, it also asks whether it presents suicide as a common or acceptable response to hardship, and instead suggests that media reports that coping skills, support, and treatment work for most people who have thought about suicide, which I think is very well presented through Quaid's character, who are being helped back on their feet by Blocker and his men, she makes a return to normalcy throughout the film, or what can be called normalcy. Um, there's also the question that if it's oversimplifying or speculating on the reason for the suicide, and it, reporting on suicide.org instead suggests that media describes the warning signs and risk factors, including mental illness, that give the suicide context. For this, you can look at Metz. Metz, his introduction in the film is him discussing that he has been diagnosed with melancholia, and as a result, the government has taken his guns. And it's only because he has given his guns back as he joins the final mission of Blocker that he is able to gain access to what inevitably kills him. Um, now, moving into the recommendations from reporting on suicide.org, they state that media should emphasize help and hope and stories of recovery through help seeking and positive coping skills, which, again, I feel like is very well done by uh, Blocker's character and his support, Quaid's character, as well as just Quaid's response and responsiveness to this help. And I think that it does show a very healthy relationship there for two characters who can come together and are united in this grief that they are able to share and experience together. Now, getting into the consultant's memo, while I agree with its depiction from a purely storytelling perspective, Metz's suicide being tied to a final heroic action as he, after expressing his suicidal ideation and expressing regret for what he has done over the course of his career, this could be seen as problematic, as reporting on suicide does note the dangers of glamorizing or romanticizing suicide, with this being tied to the perception of suicide as tied to heroism or honor or loyalty to a group. So my recommendation would just be to separate those two events. He can still do both, but does not have the two events be tied together. Not have him chasing after a criminal, killing the person who just killed part of his group, and then committing suicide off screen at the same time. Just you don't want to risk having that association there. Second recommendation would be to be more explicit with the fact that what allowed Metz to eventually die by suicide is that his guns were returned to him. Perhaps by having his guns withheld by Blocker until it's closer to the time of his death, instead of them being returned to him as soon as their journey starts. Now, I would not have thought that this was needed, but the complete silence on the subject in reviews, even those coming from reputable sources, has made me think twice on this. This change would help to support the idea of coupling theory, as discussed in the November 3rd and 5th lectures, which is already implicit in the film, and I personally think that they do a pretty good job. But again, it's the silence from reviewers that makes me make this recommendation. And this idea of coupling theory tells us that Metz's suicide is a coupling of his vulnerability and his access to a specific, highly lethal and or culturally acceptable method in his gun. Now, one thing going now into the public's response, one thing that I noticed in reading these reviews is that almost none of them, or actually from what I found, none of them touch on the suicide or suicidal ideation within the film, either approaching it with very gentle language or more frequently not mentioning it at all. For example, Godfrey Cheshire, writing for RogerEbert.com, seems like he might get into it, as he states that one reason the story gets off to a strong start is Christian Bale's effectiveness in conveying his character's bitterness and anger. Though his mouth is largely covered by a droopy handlebar mustache, Bale's fierce eyes radiate looks that are at once haunted and haunting, reflecting years of pain and rage. But then he immediately moves to talking about the start of the character's journey to Montana. He also makes no mention of misdiagnosis of melancholia, which led to the military taking his guns, or of Blocker's near suicide. Hell, it doesn't even include any mention of Metz's eventual suicide. Likewise, Jim Cornelius of Frontier Partisan, in his review, Hostiles, A Tale of Trauma from the American Frontier, notes that the violence of Hostiles is, by contemporary standards, not particularly graphic, but there is something in the way writer-director Cooper handles it, the implied ferocity that makes it especially harrowing and unsettling. He also notes how, in depicting that perseverance, in the face of unimaginable loss, pain, and fear, Hostiles is ultimately redemptive. But this talk of perseverance and trauma completely avoids, or at least skirts around to that idea of perseverance, the topic of suicide. In The Modern Taboo, that Americans just can't seem to break, an article by Sarah Gregory Youngblood, she discusses the difficulty that many people have with coming to accept the reality of death. She states that if you want to start grappling with the reality of death, the first step is to ask yourself questions about the end of your own life, though it can feel scary. What does a life well lived look like for you? How do you want to die? How do you want to be remembered? For Metz, we can see him struggle with these ideas of a life well lived and how he will be remembered. He's had to come around to the fact that he is on the wrong side of history not once, but twice, as it's revealed that he fought for the Confederacy before joining up with the US Army after the war. And he says as much just before his own suicide when he tells Chief Yellowhawk that the treatment of natives at the hands of the US government, at his own hands, is unforgivable before riding off to take his own life. So, why aren't these reviews talking about depictions of suicide in the film, even when they're such an integral part of the story and themes? In Jose del Real's The Reinvention of a Real Man, Bill, who is a 59 years old and white, is working out his own theory, it states. It has to do with the gap between the expectations men have for their lives and the reality of their individual experiences, worsened by cultural norms that discourage them from expressing any emotions besides anger. Now, intersecting with this theory of Bill's is what Dr. Hernandez mentioned on November 5th, which is that one of the few places where it's socially acceptable for men to express their grief is in the military. This could explain why reviews like this are more likely to discuss the death that comes as a result or the trauma that comes as a result of external conflicts rather than internal conflict, as the militaristic deaths are more acceptable, while these deaths as a result of suicide and the internal struggles that cause them are even within media that covers death and is, I mean, as stated, one of the reviews even has trauma in the title, but they can't touch on this taboo idea.